July 1941. Eastern Front. German soldiers heard a sound they would never forget. Not artillery, not bombers, something else entirely. A screaming, howling noise tearing through the sky. Then the world exploded. 320 rockets. 25 seconds. The ground itself seemed to catch fire. These were the same Wehrmacht troops who had conquered Poland in weeks, steamrolled through France, crushed every army in their path. Now they were diving into ditches, covering their ears, watching their ammunition depots vanish in walls of flame. The Russians called it Katyusha. The Germans called it Stalin's organ. And it was about to become Nazi Germany's most wanted weapon. Here's the thing, though. Germany would capture these launchers. They would study them, dismantle them, analyze every component, and yet they would never successfully copy them. This is the story of why. Orsha, Belarus, 14th of July, 1941. German forces had just secured a major railway junction. Fuel depots lined up, ammunition stockpiled, supply lines established. They felt untouchable. Then the sky turned red. German officers looked up expecting to see Soviet aircraft. The sky was empty. No planes. Just these streaking trails of fire arcing through the air, and that ungodly scream. Truck-mounted launchers, barely visible in the distance, were spitting rockets like a dragon. The BM-13 Katyusha in action for the first time in combat. One German officer wrote in his diary that night, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the rockets came in waves like a screaming nightmare, that the sound alone broke men before the explosions. Even started. Think about what made this weapon so terrifying. Speed first. 12 rockets every single second for 25 seconds straight. German artillery crews needed minutes to fire, reload, fire again. This thing emptied its entire payload before they could even respond. Range: 8.5 kilometers. That's further than most German guns could shoot. These Soviet trucks could sit outside German artillery range and rain hell. Mobility. This is the key. Traditional artillery took hours to set up, dig in, establish firing positions. The Katyusha was mounted on a truck. Fire your volley, drive away, be gone into minutes. By the time German counter-battery fire arrived, there was nothing but empty road, and that sound. German soldiers started calling it Stalin's organ because the rockets produced this distinctive, wailing shriek, psychological warfare before the first explosion even hit. German high command wanted answers immediately. Intelligence reports flooded in. What is this weapon? How does it work? Where are they making it? How many do they have? But here's what the Germans didn't know. The weapon's real designation was BM-13. Boyovaya Machina, combat vehicle. Katyusha was just a nickname. There was this popular Soviet song at the time called Katyusha, about a young woman waiting for a soldier to return from the border. Russian troops started calling the launcher Katyusha because both were beloved, both were protective, and both were deadly when they needed to be. The development story goes back to the 1930s. Soviet rocket scientists Georgy Lenkmok and Ivan Gavay were working in secret on solid-fuel rockets. Stalin understood something crucial. The next war wouldn't be won by who had the biggest guns. It would be won by who could deliver the most firepower the fastest. Traditional artillery was powerful, but slow. You fire, you reload, you recalculate, you fire again. It's a deliberate process. Stalin wanted something that could saturate an area with explosives in seconds, not minutes. The solution was multiple rocket launchers. Not one big gun, dozens of small rockets fired simultaneously. By 1938 they had working prototypes. But then Stalin's paranoia kicked in. The Great Purge was consuming Soviet leadership. Wehrmacht was declared an enemy of the state and executed, just killed. The brilliant scientist who helped create this weapon never saw it used in combat. But the project survived. Other engineers took over. And by 1941, when Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet Union had this ace up its sleeve. That first use at Orsha wasn't just effective. It was devastating. German intelligence reports described complete chaos. Ammunition dumps destroyed. Fuel depots obliterated. German troops scattered. The Wehrmacht had planned to crush the Soviet Union in 6 weeks. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, overwhelming force and speed. But the Katyusha added a variable they hadn't accounted for. Suddenly, the Soviets had a weapon that could match German tactical mobility. So German High Command issued standing orders. Capture a Katyusha launcher at any cost. Find out how it works. Reverse engineer it. Copy it. Build a better version. This wasn't unusual. German military philosophy was built on superior engineering. If the enemy has something good, you capture it, study it, and make an improved version. They'd done it before with tanks, with aircraft, designs, with everything. But capturing a Katyusha turned out to be incredibly difficult. Soviet crews had strict protocols. Fire your rockets, immediately relocate. Never stay in one position more than 2 minutes. And if there was any chance of capture, destroy the launcher. Blow it up. Burn it. Don't let it fall into German hands intact. The Soviets knew what they had. They knew if Germany copied this technology, the advantage would disappear. But eventually, inevitably, the Germans got one. Actually, they got several. Damaged launchers, abandoned equipment, captured installations. By 1941, German engineers had multiple Katyusha systems to examine. And this is where the story gets fascinating. German engineers disassembled everything. The launch rails, the rocket motors, the ignition systems, the truck, mountings. Every component was measured, photographed, analyzed. Their initial assessment was almost dismissive. The engineering was crude by German standards. The rockets weren't precision instruments. The launchers were just rails welded to truck beds. There was nothing sophisticated here. One German report described it as typical Soviet design. Rough, simple, mass-producible, not elegant, not refined, just functional. And that's when the Germans made their first mistake. They assumed they could build something better. See, German military industry in 1941 was built around precision, engineering, tight tolerances, quality control. Their tanks were masterpieces of mechanical engineering. Their aircraft were technological marvels. Everything was designed to be the best possible version. So when they looked at the Katyusha, they didn't see. A brilliant weapon. They saw a crude weapon that needed improvement. They started designing German versions. Better stabilization for improved accuracy. More powerful rocket motors for extended range. Precision guidance systems. Higher grade steel for the launch rails. The prototypes they built were genuinely impressive from an engineering standpoint. More accurate than the Soviet version. Longer range. Better build quality. But here's the problem. They were also more expensive, more complex, slower to manufacture, required specialized parts, needed trained crews to operate and maintain them. The whole point of the Katyusha wasn't to be the best rocket launcher theoretically possible. It was to be a rocket launcher. You could build thousands of quickly and throw into battle. Soviet factories were churning out Katyushas using basic materials and semi-skilled labor. A truck, some rails, a firing mechanism. Simple solid-fuel rockets that didn't need complex guidance systems. Because you were firing hundreds at once. Accuracy didn't matter when you were saturating an entire grid square. The Germans built better rocket launchers technically, but they couldn't build them fast enough. They couldn't build them cheap enough. And they couldn't deploy them in the numbers needed to match what the Soviets were doing. There was also a resource problem. Germany was fighting a multi-front war by this point. Every piece of steel, every factory hour, every trained worker had to be allocated carefully. Building thousands of rocket launchers meant not building tanks, or aircraft or submarines. The Soviet Union had different mathematics. They had vast resources, massive industrial capacity once it was relocated beyond the Urals, and a willingness to accept simpler designs if it meant more production. By 1942, the Soviets were producing Katyushas at an incredible rate, not just BM-13s. They developed smaller versions, larger versions, different rocket calibers. BM-8 with smaller rockets, BM-31 with massive rockets. Adaptations for different tactical situations. Entire units were designated as Guards mortar units. Guards because these weapons were considered elite. Mortar because the Soviets wanted to hide what they actually were. Secrecy and deception even in unit designations. The Germans, meanwhile, were still trying to perfect their rocket launcher designs. They did eventually field some systems. The Nebelwerfer series. These were actually quite effective. But they never achieved the scale of deployment that the Katyusha had. And there was one more factor, something the Germans discovered too late. The Katyusha's crudeness was actually an advantage in the field. When something broke, and things always break in combat, Soviet crews could fix it with basic tools. Weld a new rail, replace a truck component, jury-rig, firing mechanism. The simplicity meant it was maintainable under terrible conditions. German rocket systems, being more sophisticated, required specialized parts and trained technicians. On the Eastern Front, in -40-degree weather, with supply lines stretched to breaking point, complexity became a liability. Soviet soldiers could repair a Katyusha with a hammer and a welding torch. German systems needed workshops. By 1943, Katyushas were everywhere on the Eastern Front. The Battle of Kursk saw massed Katyusha batteries breaking up German armor formations. The liberation of Belarus. the push into Poland, the final assault on Berlin. That distinctive scream became the soundtrack of Soviet advance. German forces learned to fear that sound. Air raid sirens could be ignored if you were in a bunker. Artillery whistles gave you seconds to react. But when you heard the Katyusha scream, you knew saturation bombardment was coming. Nowhere in the target area was safe after the war. Captured. German documents revealed just how much the Katyusha affected German tactical planning. Units had to disperse more. Concentrating forces became dangerous. Supply depots had to be spread out and camouflaged. The mere existence of Katyushas forced the Germans to fight differently. So why couldn't Germany build their own version successfully? It wasn't technology. It wasn't engineering capability. It was philosophy. The Germans wanted to build the perfect weapon. The Soviets built a good enough weapon they could make 10,000 of. The Germans wanted precision and quality. The Soviets wanted quantity and speed. The Germans built weapons for professional soldiers to operate. The Soviets built weapons that conscripts could use effectively after basic training. This pattern repeated throughout the war. German Tiger tanks versus Soviet T-34S. German jet aircraft versus Soviet mass-produced fighters. Over-engineering versus practical production. And here's the really interesting part. After World War II, rocket artillery became standard in almost every army. But the designs that dominated weren't based on German precision systems. They were based on the Katyusha concept: simple, mobile, mass-producible, devastating in volume. Modern multiple-launch rocket systems, things like the American HIMARS or the Russian Tornado, they're all spiritual descendants of that crude truck-mounted launcher the Soviets fielded in 1941. The weapon that Germany captured but couldn't build didn't fail because of Soviet secrecy. It failed because the Germans couldn't accept that crude and simple could defeat sophisticated and complex. Katyusha, a love song turned into a weapon, a nightmare that screamed across the Eastern Front. The rocket launcher that proves sometimes the best engineering solution is the one you can actually build and deploy. Germany had the scientists, the engineers, the industrial capability, but they didn't have the philosophy. And in war, sometimes philosophy matters more than perfection.